right, folks. Thanks. In the valiant, indeed heroic attempt to stay close to schedule, I think we will start. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing one of my best-known, smartest colleagues, Kimberle Crenshaw. That people always say people don't need an introduction. In this case, it really is true. Kimberle Crenshaw does not need an introduction. As a core member of the CRS faculty, she has been a significant part of the intellectual presence here. She will think and talk about history and what this moment means in the context of the history that she both initiated, participated in, and also recorded. And I will let her give you the sense of that kind of historical continuum. What I do want to emphasize is that this conference and everything that it stands for is both on the cutting edge of what we're doing by crossing interdisciplinary boundaries, but also is a continuation of a long tradition of deep scholarship and activism that, again, Professor Crenshaw stands for in so many interesting ways. You know her through mass media. You know her through some of the most important writings about race and retrenchment, as well as co-editing an important red book. If you don't know what it is one of the most important, arguably the most important reader on critical race theory that also Neil Gitanda, who is here at this conference, was a co-editor on. All of her contributions, both intellectually, public intellectually, as well as within the economy, have been in some ways astonishing in its significance, and we're thankful to have her here. So with no more time taken up, Professor Crenshaw.
Good afternoon. What a great, wonderful event and a wonderful crowd. It's wonderful to see all of you. I realize that this is the first talk that I've given in about 3 years without a PowerPoint. And I totally feel like I'm without my training wheels. I have so come to rely on the picture to remind me of the story that I'm supposed to be telling. So you'll have to bear with me. It's also odd. This is a story that I've told in lots of different occasions, yet I found myself writing it and rewriting it and writing again just to get it right for this particular occasion. This is an anniversary kind of moment, and there are kind of ritualistic expectations that go along with talks around anniversaries, or almost anything around an anniversary. So, it's a remembrance. It could be a toast. Usually an older person gets up and talks about what happened back in the day, and most of the younger people sort of roll their eyes and wait for it to be over. And it seems to me that I can't quite do that for a couple reasons. I mean, number one, CRT was all about doing transgressive kinds of things, so it'd be kind of odd for me just to, roll out a story about CRT with no engagement with the current moment, so I can't do that. And I also don't feel old, so I don't want to do something that old people do when they're looking back 20 years. So I want to tell a story about CRT and kind of use that image of, those time-lapse photography things where you see a rose sort of bud real quickly and then sort of fade, although forget about the fade, we don't want the fade part. But I want to tell a story as a way of focusing on the particular dimensions of critical race theory as an engagement with race and colorblind space. In fact, if there's one thing that one can say describes what critical race theory was at its moment of instantiation and what it continued to be, and what I would say continues to be, is an engagement with the various ways in which race and colorblind spaces has been framed, has been legitimized, and has been contested. So that's the kind of story that I want to tell. I also want to bring some inflection to the telling of the story. And let me name a couple of pieces that I want to bring to the table. This year I've been spending a lot of time with social psychologists up at the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. And it's been fun. We're finding ways in which some of the disciplinary constraints that we're all dealing with have analogs in each of the disciplines. We're finding ways in which we talk very similarly about some relationships. And one relationship that we talk about somewhat similarly is mutual constitution. Our social psychologists there, such as Hazel Marcus and Glenn Adams, they remind us that one of the foundational and limiting contexts in the field of psychology is the idea of the individual as a singularly constituted entity, like this self-contained unit of stuff that's inside. That stuff might be intelligence, it might be preferences, it might be personalities, and this stuff simply finds expression in the social world. Where Marcus and others who are engaged in social cultural orientation around the idea of the individual talk about the individual as being mutually constituted through a range of interactions with cultural and social institutional stuff. So the culture and the social institution help make the individual and vice versa. Well, I want to borrow these frames not only to highlight the dynamic construction of critical race theory, but to go further to suggest its ongoing organic dimensions. Like Kendall Thomas, who broke down something that we were always saying, but I'm not sure we really understood. Race is socially constructed. By saying to us, race is less a verb and more a noun, less a noun and more a verb, something that's done, a process, rather than a thing. So both of these notions, I think, come nicely together as we think about CRT in this moment, which is first a dynamic engagement rather than a fixed product. And more specifically, it's shaped by institutional engagements over specific articulations and practices pertaining to race and colorblind spaces. So I want to foreground in this telling the ongoing negotiation between certain agents and the structure in which we are collectively embedded. So our conference title nicely captures this, Race in Colorblind Spaces, and it continues to be an interrogation of critical race theory. Now, there have been several tellings of critical race theory. I participated in some of them. Other authors have their own point of departure. One thing that I also want to bring to this telling, though, is the specific social cultural context that give critical race theory as it's practiced in different institutions a certain kind of accent. So we all might be socialized in a particular culture to speak a different language, but how we speak it, the inflections that we use, are often a product of the context in which we learned it, in the context in which we learned how to use and deploy certain kinds of articulations. And with that as a foregrounding principle, I want to talk a little bit about UCLA. As a site that created a certain accent to the practice of critical race theory, and broaden that a little bit to Southern California more broadly, the Southern California law schools as being a site for the development of critical race theory. So the idea here is to look at a broad historical moment out of which critical race theory emerged, but more particularly the way that it emerged in relationship to specific institutional configurations, and finally bring that home to talk about how the specific social cultural dynamic of race in this colorblind space may function quite similarly to the kinds of engagements that began critical race theory in the early 80s. So that is my itinerary. So now let me get on to the story. In 1989, 24 scholars of color answered a call to attend a conference called New Developments in Critical Race Theory at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Like many of you here, they agreed to present some written piece, but many of them were not sure at all about whether this was a party worth standing in line to get into. Now, after all, the title itself was, to be honest, a bit misleading. New Developments in Critical Race Theory somewhat suggested that there was a pre-existing critical race theory, that these new developments were going to engage and somehow surpass. So the new sort of presumed that there was an old. And in fact, there was not an old prior to the very moment that these invitations were written and sent to various people. So who were the people that made up this group that invited these folks? Well, they're folks who were operating out of some common history. There are folks who believed that we weren't fully making it up out of whole cloth. We had some idea that there was a possibility that we were trying to name, and that our objectives had some kind of content to them, even though we weren't there yet. There was no there at the moment. Now, the folks that made up that letter were folks who I sometimes call motley crew of minority scholars who populated the backdoor speakeasies at the Association of American Law Schools. That's the major sort of, centrist organization of law professors. So we go to those events and then we get together in somebody's hotel room, maybe drink a little bit and, talk about how crazy some of the sessions were, how the conversation about race was dominated by a very few scholars who didn't seem to engage us in any particular way. So, it was a bitch and moan session. We would get together and talk and come up with sort of common kind of critiques where you just started and people would start nodding their heads. So there was a dialogue, a discourse that was positioned in the off spaces of AALS. We also had in common the fact that a lot of us were also speakeasy participants at critical legal studies meetings. So that was the left organization of largely white American law professors. And so we'd go to their conferences and kind of enjoy in the critique of the rule of law and enjoy the critique of law schools as institutions that reproduce hierarchy. Then we get in the room and say, can you believe that they never say anything about race? Can you believe that we can talk about class and pretty much every other social construction around which power aggregates, but race can't be one of them? So we talk in those. So what this group had in common is we spent a lot of time doing that together over a couple of years. So who were they? Well, one was an Asian American scholar who was at the very first Critical Legal Studies conference in the late 70s. Another was an African American Marxist scholar, a woman, a feminist who participated in CLS in the 80s. Another was a law student who was part of the Critical Legal Studies summer camps. Another one was a Chicano law professor who had written an article that had been described as being intolerably incendiary for naming names about how the conversation about race was constituted with no people of color in it. So, that at that moment was just groundbreaking to actually come out and say, hey, you're having a conversation about race and people of color ain't part of it. That might be a problem. So he was part of this group, and finally a third-year law professor at UCLA. Those people respectively were Neil Gatanda, Stephanie Phillips, Terry Miller, Richard Delgado, and myself. So what we were looking for was to engage others to come out of the shadows, to come out of the speakeasy orientation and actually try to engage in both an act and a conversation, an act of coming out and saying, okay, there might be something coherent that holds this conversation together, and we're going to try to claim what that is. That was an act, you might call it a speech act. It was also a conversation that we were inviting people to have. So we were veterans in one way or another of institutional struggles around the very issues that we wanted to talk about in American law school. So I want you to hold this moment kind of constant for a minute, 1989, where we're writing this letter inviting people to a there that isn't quite there yet, but if they come, it will be a there. And then go back a little bit earlier to another moment. And this moment features a good guy law professor, a dean, a liberal dean at what was regarded as a liberal elite law school, Harvard Law School. And he's got a problem, a serious problem. It's 1983. It's years after the heyday of the civil rights movement, brought down all the white-only signs across America's formally segregated institutions. Harvard, of course, wasn't one of those institutions. Yet, as this liberal dean sat face-to-face with an assortment of colored students, he presided over a faculty of more than 70 members, of which only one was a tenured person of color. Now, things hadn't been all that bad a year before. He had 100% more participation. Derek Bell was there, and Derek Bell decided to leave. I would presume that our dean would have thought that he left because he was frustrated that it seemed that the pool problem just couldn't be resolved in a timely enough fashion to satisfy Bell's desire for colleagues and others who were engaged in the project that he saw as important. So here these students were, similarly impatient, demanding that Bell's course be taught, and expecting that he use this course as an opportunity to vet minority law professors to bring them on to Harvard's law faculty. Now, what these students didn't understand, I'm sure, from the dean's perspective, is that first of all, this course wasn't part of the core curriculum. It was a boutique course. We all know these courses. They're the things that you let people teach because you should let people teach what they want to teach sometimes, as long as they teach things that you need them to teach. But when you're gone, the idea that that course remains is sort of like, you know, when you're gone, your shadow's gone too. And this course was part of Derek Bell's shadow, constitutional law and minority issues. There was no reason for Harvard to continue to teach this particular course. That was the first problem he had. The second problem he had is that we assumed that there was just an unlimited pool of minority talent throughout the country. And, you know, we were naive. We didn't know that there were probably 3 people that could come to Harvard Law School and teach. He'd been on the phone with most of them, and they weren't willing to leave a couple $1 million a year to come and teach at Harvard Law School. So how does he express this to these eager students? So he chooses the Socratic method. This is a language that, you know, these law students can understand. So the first thing he says to us is, what's so special about a course on constitutional law and minority issues that you can't get from taking con law, doing a legal aid placement, maybe being a housing investigator? I mean, come on, after all, you know, race is basically a matter of discrimination. You can find the basic tools to give you an understanding of that by taking these courses and going into, you know, sort of an applied situation where you can see how the tools work, or maybe not. And so then the second thing he said to us, again in a Socratic tone, was, wouldn't you prefer an excellent white professor over a mediocre black one? So we're smart, you know, law students. We're supposed to have the answer to that question right on the tip of our tongues. We sat there in stunned silence. Perhaps all sides were trying to figure out how to take full measure of what had just happened. Or maybe we just gandered a glance at what this conversation portended for the future. Or maybe it was kind of like when you stub your toe, you know that the pain is coming, but it takes a couple seconds before it really hits you. The only question is whose toe was stubbed at that moment. So after a moment, all hell broke loose at Harvard Law School. Within the space of 2 years, Harvard would become the scene of acrimony, unlike any time since the Vietnam War. The halls would be occupied by students. The sacred faculty library would be sat in. Somebody would actually sit on the dean's desk. I won't say who that was. You know, during this undertaking. So what he set in motion was an engagement with a set of ideas that justified and legitimized a particular set of patterns of relationships in and at Harvard Law School. So one of the beautiful things is he put the rhetoric of racial exclusion in language that was clear enough for us to understand. You didn't need a white-only sign to understand what he was saying when he was talking about the pool problem. So what it was a nice picture with illustrations of when it looks like this, here's how we describe it. So when it looks like a segregated institution, a liberal organization like Harvard will say it's a problem of merit. Right? When there are no qualified people that they're willing to bring onto the faculty, they'll frame it in terms of race-neutral credentialing processes. When the constitution of the pool engages prioritization of issues and experiences that exclude people of color and their problems and their interests, it's called a pool problem. Right? So this was just a nice sort of paint by the numbers. This is what we mean when we say that. This is the accent that was given to colorblindness at Harvard Law School. We learned the language. We learned to be able to decipher what was being said. We also were invited to create what we were asking to learn, which is a kind of odd thing for a dean to do. If you want us to teach it to us, tell us what difference it would make if you knew it. Well, we didn't know it yet, but his invitation sent us to Derek Bell's book, which we read as a class, and his claim that there were no people of color who were qualified to teach at Harvard Law School meant that we decided to go out and find who the people of color were. We pulled all our resources as student organizations and brought these non-existent people to Harvard Law School, each to teach a chapter out of Derek Bell's book. Now, what was significant about this is a group of people became acquainted with a common set of texts, a common set of engagements with the question of race in colorblind space. It was a different engagement than the ones that had been prioritized earlier, because while those dealt with questions about how do you weigh questions of racial justice against other so-called neutral values like federalism or vested rights, or separation of power, or even the market, Bell showed these concepts were actually repositories of racial power. They're not weighed against. Racial power actually is in those very concepts. So what we had was a group of students and law professors who had studied a particular set of texts with a framework or a paradigm that was in fact critical of the dominant way in which race was being talked about in American legal institutions. Now, the third thing that the engagement brought to us is the contradictions over affirmative action. This was shocking to us because many of us had come out of institutions where we had learned about the civil rights movement. There were all these heroes out there that we thought we were sort of on the same side of. And so when they started writing letters to the editor in the New York Times denouncing us as basically being race-dependent students who were committing the same sin that the leaders of the civil rights movement were arguing against, the idea that one's race constitutes moral value. When they started saying that, we thought, okay, there's a lot of confusion going on about what is at issue here. One of the real interesting contradictions was sort of reflected by Carl Rowan, whose first op-ed, basically called us crazy, discriminating against what the law schools, who the law schools proposed teachers were. So I have to stop and say one thing. What the law school proposed to do in response to our alternative course on constitutional law and minority issues was to teach a 3-week seminar on civil rights litigation, which is a great idea. But civil rights litigation is only about race in the context of specific kinds of claims of discrimination. It is a piece, but not the whole, of the way that law shapes race. So we boycotted it. And the way it got framed is, you're boycotting this thing because a white civil rights attorney is coming to teach it. Right. Now, his race was significant to us because we said this is also not answering our demand for affirmative action, but that got turned into the idea that race and merit are the same in our view, and that was seen as violating the civil rights ethos. So we left that with a sense that even among liberal civil rights advocates, there is confusion about the affirmative action argument. In other words, while we saw race and the lens through which you experienced the law and thought about it as a potential qualifying aspect of one's file, most of our civil rights advocates saw that as being problematic. On the other hand, they wanted to hold Harvard accountable for failing to engage in affirmative action. So, this idea about how to think about race and merit, how to think about race and subjectivity was deeply confusing even among our allies. So I have to speed forward because what I wanted to do here was just mark the particular way that the initial engagement with the rhetoric of justification in a liberal institution helped frame our understanding about issues such as meritocracy, colorblindness, and how we needed to go about creating an understanding that responded to it. Now, the flip side of this, which I have to mention briefly, is that we weren't just struggling with moderate institutions, but also with left-leaning law professors who deeply believed that law was a legitimizing institution, but also believed that race was a false construct. So I'll just give you an example. Critical legal studies really sold itself as a set of institutional engagements. The idea was we engage power in our workplace, where we are, not out there. So critical legal studies folks actually were our allies at Harvard. They helped us with the alternative course. So naturally we thought, well, this might be a good home for us. We're going to go into critical legal studies, and we're going to use some of the tools that had been developed to think about the false necessity that law creates in making people think that the world pretty much has to be the way it is. The way in which law neutralizes and normalizes deep conflict. We want to apply that thinking to thinking about race. Most importantly, we want to think about workplace activism as the place to start. So we decided what we'll do in critical legal studies is go in with the idea that we start here. That was what was funny, right? The idea that we'll start here. And at one of the national conferences, we had this little workshop for the entire organization. And in the workshop, we asked, what is it about the whiteness of critical legal studies that keeps people of color at bay? It's hard to describe the reaction at that moment. I will just say that one very well-known scholar was apoplectic and stood up and said, "You're mau-mauing us," which we thought was an interesting choice of terms, and if we let this continue, this is going to tear the organization apart. So much for engaging in the site where you are. So what was going on here was a recognition that while CLS had a lot of tools for us that were useful, it also engaged in a certain understanding of race and colorblind space. It understood its space as colorblind, and race as a project that was happening out there somewhere, not here in CLS. So that's the kind of multiple engagement that was constituting us as yet undefined, but eventually as critical race scholars. We were critical with respect to mainstream institutional discourses. That's what made us want to foreground the idea of critical engagement. We were also about race in the context of critical legal studies. So the idea of critical race theory comes from those two things, along with the idea that we're not just looking at practice. We're looking at about ideological constitution. So we're looking at theory as well. Now, I said I wanted to say a few words about UCLA, so let me say that. In 1987, this is again before we move directly to the workshop, there was a conference called The Sounds of Silence, and it was about race. It was a critical legal studies conference. It was hosted by UCLA, Loyola, and USC. I want to say that UCLA played a significant role, not simply in the fact that it hosted the event, but it also signals, important signals, to those of us who were new to this institution, that foregrounding race was not only not so exceptional that we might not get tenure, but actually it was something that we could employ. So this is what I mean when I say cultural, social accents in various institutions, because while colorblindness was a background ideology that in some way shaped the understandings of places like Harvard, Stanford, and UCLA, the extent to which it could be meaningfully accepted was different in different institutions. By accepted, I mean exempted. So here at UCLA, we had a very aggressive affirmative action program for admissions. 40% of our students were admitted based on non-traditional criteria. More than that, we were the home of one of the founding leaders of the Law and Society movement that looked at law as applied as opposed to just framed law as almost a scientific enterprise. We had, at the time that I was hired here, probably the only female dean and associate dean combination in American law schools. That sent a particular signal. If nothing else sent a signal, I'll just speak for myself. I was affirmative action hire. I know it. The more I sit through faculty meetings, I become convinced of it. I know I would not be hired today. And my job talk was on colorblindness. It was on colorblindness and responding to the critique of rights. What I want to foreground here is the institutional arrangements that were nurturing of the idea of contesting race, even as certain ideas were held constant in the background. Right? So UCLA had a particular kind of accent. I'm going to probably violate some notion of things that should be held secret and tell you another institutional accent, that being of Stanford, where there was a different kind of accent. Right? One of the things that happened just before the critical race theory workshop was Derek Bell, who was visiting at Stanford. So I'm going to tell it. Derek Bell, who was visiting at Harvard, at Stanford at the time, teaching a constitutional law course. And teaching a constitutional law course from what we consider to be the defensible platform of the fundamental contradiction upon which our Constitution is based, the idea of slavery, with an articulation of freedom. And he uses that as a way of thinking about a whole range of constitutional issues. Students complained about this course, feeling like they were somehow getting the bootleg version of constitutional law. And so the way that the institution responded to it was to set up a series of alternative lectures to which they invited Derek to come and give a talk. Bell didn't realize until the very first lecture, when Balsa stood up and denounced the event as an accommodation to racial responses to Derek Bell's course. Now, I tell that story in part because Stanford, like Harvard, would have viewed itself as a place that was exceedingly liberal on questions of race. In fact, many of our critical legal studies advocates were at Stanford. Their particular accent was, we're so beyond race that we don't even see race as a category. We're postmodern about race. Yet within this postmodern framing on race, this particular kind of racial insult could happen. So I'm trying to frame this in terms of the different accents that create different conditions of possibility. It's no accident that if you're down here, you're more likely to engage in a certain kind of race interrogation, then you're in a place like that where the leading interrogator is treated in that particular way. UCLA was probably the first institution to actually tenure critical race theorists. I think the first to hire openly, I like that idea, openly practicing critical race theorists. So obviously it has a particular sensibility. So I tell you that backstory just to tell you that finally we all came together in 1989, bringing all of this backdrop towards an explicit articulation of what it is we had in common. We not only shared papers, but we thought it was important for somebody to articulate what the thematic consistency was across these different papers. So it wasn't just sharing ideas, but it was sharing ideas with an idea to figuring out what we have in common. In subsequent conferences, we explicitly looked at interdisciplinary approaches. We looked at postmodernism, we looked at history, we looked at literary criticism, all trying to find tools to help us engage in race and colorblind space. Now, let me use last few minutes to talk about where we are now, because I think we've had a seismic shift. And in the same way that Harvard was the font and centerpiece of a particular kind of engagement, UCLA may interestingly be that space right now. As many of you know, we are under constraints here, created by 209. It might be framed that we are simply responding to external constraints. However, remember the mutual constitution I talked about earlier. Nothing is solely a response to external constraints. We've chosen institutionally to interrogate some things and not others. We're supposed to not engage in preference and discrimination. However, we tend to focus on admissions and focus there solely on the former affirmative action programs without focusing on the various ways in which one could say everyday practice here reflects preferences and discrimination. So this is a picture of post-racial colorblind spaces in which this is the picture. You know, we can talk about the statistics, and here is the subtitle. This is what's said. 209 made us do it. Right? So in the same way that the dean's unfortunate comments there forced us to grapple with, to think about, to move beyond the limited terms of how race was thought about then, this particular moment, and I like to call it sort of like a whiplash, because we're out in front for a long time, and then suddenly, bam, we're over in the other corner, gives us a particular vantage point from which to think about how race functions in a formally diverse environment, which is no longer as diverse as it used to be. I want to end by just reminding us of how the response of institutions can actually be the best thing that happens to us. Some of you might have seen Eyes on the Prize, when Coretta Scott King says, look, you know, when we first started protesting, the only thing we wanted was a more equitable version of segregation. We wanted there to be a black space and a white space, and it shouldn't move depending on how many white people got on the bus. And when the bus company said, forget about it, we said, well, you know, might as well go for broke, right? Might as well demand the whole enchilada. If the dean at Harvard Law School had just given us the alternative course, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today, right? And similarly, if after 209 there had really been an effort to think about race in colorblind space in a critical way, if we were to interrogate all of the institutional practices that have been labeled colorblind but are in fact not, you might not be sitting here today. I want to say that we need to take the part of that is productive as the center point of the conversation that we're going to have here over the next couple of days. Remembering critical race theory is not a thing, it is an interactive dynamic. This changes as the context changes. The changing context we have now is a formal requirement that we be colorblind, and what we're looking for and thinking about is how other disciplinary tools can help us identify the ways in which it is not colorblind, and more importantly, not help us just to understand, but help us to transform. Thank you.
Thank Professor Crenshaw for making an amazing speech that sets the context for all that we're doing this weekend. We're about 15 minutes behind, but we do want to try to stay on track, and Professor Crenshaw will be around so that I'm sure that people have questions. But the panel was initially started at 1:30. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, 1:40 at the latest, and then come back here. Try to just pop in and come right back out. We'll start the panel at 1:40.